You know what's interesting? There's a person right now, somewhere, paying for a dinner they can't afford, wearing shoes that cost more than their rent, and posting photos of a vacation they're still paying off in installments. And from the outside, it looks like confidence. It looks like success. But psychology tells a very different story. Because spending to impress others isn't really about money. It's never been about money. It's about something much deeper happening inside the brain. And once you understand what that actually is, you'll never look at conspicuous consumption the same way again. Let's start with a concept psychologists call social signaling. Humans have always used visible markers to communicate status. For thousands of years, that meant the size of your territory, the strength of your tribe, the quality of your tools. But in modern society, those signals became objects: cars, clothes, watches, restaurants. The underlying psychological drive is ancient, but the expression is very recent. And here's the critical thing most people miss. The person doing it usually isn't fully aware of why. The decision feels like a personal choice. It feels like taste or preference. But beneath the surface, a very specific emotional architecture is driving the behavior. Psychologists refer to this as extrinsic motivation. When a person's sense of self-worth becomes dependent on how they're perceived by others rather than how they actually feel internally, they begin to seek external validation through visible performance. What they buy becomes a way of saying something they struggle to believe about themselves. I'm successful. I'm worthy. I belong here. And this is where the research becomes genuinely fascinating. Studies on status-driven spending consistently point to one core variable: self-esteem instability. Not low self-esteem in the way we usually imagine it. We're not talking about someone who feels obviously insecure or shy. We're often talking about someone who appears confident, socially fluent, even dominant. But underneath that surface confidence is a self-concept that is fragile, one that requires constant external reinforcement to stay intact. Think about that for a moment. The person who never misses an opportunity to mention their salary, their car, their neighborhood, they're not bragging out of genuine pride. They're managing anxiety, quiet, constant anxiety about how they're being perceived. And the purchase, the upgrade, the status symbol, it temporarily quiets that anxiety, which is exactly why the behavior repeats. There's a neurological dimension to this that's worth understanding. When someone makes a purchase that they anticipate will raise their perceived social standing, the brain releases dopamine, not when they receive the object, before, during the anticipation of how others will react. This reward loop is powerful, and like all dopamine-driven loops, it requires escalation to maintain the same effect. What impressed people last year doesn't impress them today, so the spending has to grow, the car has to get newer, the restaurant has to become more exclusive, the vacation has to become more dramatic. The loop doesn't end, it just raises the stakes. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. The emotional high from any acquisition fades quickly, and the baseline returns to exactly where it was before, which means the person is always chasing a feeling that the spending can never permanently provide. But here's what the research really wants us to notice. The external behavior is almost always a symptom of something that formed much earlier. For a significant number of people who spend to impress, the pattern connects directly to childhood experiences around worth and approval. Growing up in an environment where love or recognition felt conditional, where accomplishment was the price of belonging, where what you had or what you achieved was the lens through which you were evaluated, the young brain learns something very direct from this. Being impressive is how you become safe. And the adult brain, even decades later, keeps running that program. The expensive watch isn't really about the watch. It's a message to a room full of people, many of whom the wearer barely knows, that says, I have made it, that I am enough. Because somewhere inside, there's still a version of that person who isn't sure. Now, there's an important nuance here. Not everyone who makes an expensive purchase is driven by insecurity. Psychologists distinguish between two different motivational orientations. There's conspicuous consumption driven by extrinsic motivation, where the purchase is fundamentally about how it will look to others. And there's genuine quality seeking,
where someone values craftsmanship, experience, or durability for its own sake, regardless of visibility. The psychological tale is a simple question. Would this person still want the object if no one would ever see it, know about it, or be impressed by it? For the status-driven spender, the answer quietly shifts. The object loses its meaning without an audience. Social comparison theory, developed by psychologist Festinger, helps explain the engine beneath all of this. Humans are wired to evaluate themselves relative to others. It's an automatic cognitive process. We look at the people around us and we measure. Where do I rank? How do I compare? For most people, this is a background process, a brief, mostly unconscious reference point. But for people caught in the cycle of status spending, social comparison becomes a dominant lens. Upward comparison, measuring yourself against people who have more, becomes almost compulsive. And every comparison that doesn't resolve in their favor generates a kind of psychological pressure that the next purchase is meant to relieve. The tragedy at the center of this pattern is that it doesn't work, not sustainably, because the reference point always moves. There will always be a bigger house in the next neighborhood, a newer car in the parking lot, a more impressive title in someone else's LinkedIn bio. The goal is definitionally unreachable, and the person running the race usually knows this on some level, but stopping feels more threatening than continuing. What makes this especially difficult to step back from is that the behavior is often socially rewarded in the short term. The watch does generate admiring comments, the car does turn heads, the dinner does photograph beautifully. These small external validations confirm the strategy. They teach the brain that the spending worked, and so the cycle continues, reinforced not just internally, but by a culture that genuinely celebrates visible markers of success and rarely asks what's underneath them. Therapists who work with people caught in this cycle often focus not on the spending itself, but on rebuilding intrinsic self-worth, the slow, unglamorous process of helping someone feel valuable independent of what they own, what others think, or how they appear in any given room. It's difficult work, because it means dismantling a strategy the brain has been running for decades, a strategy that once felt like the only available answer to the question of whether they were enough. Now, what all of this points to is something worth sitting with. The person spending beyond their means to maintain an image isn't performing strength. They're performing it precisely because somewhere inside, they're not sure they have it. The expensive clothes, the curated life, the constant signaling of success, these aren't the signs of someone who has arrived. They're the signs of someone still trying to convince themselves that they have. And maybe the most interesting thing psychology keeps circling back to is this. Real security doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The people who are most genuinely at ease with who they are tend to be remarkably quiet about it, not because they have nothing, but because they're no longer auditioning. They stopped needing the room's approval. And that, quietly, is what actually looks like freedom.